Very good morning and welcome all the attendees and panelists to the session organized by Aptivaa, which is IFRS9 Modeling Challenges, Webinar 2. This is a 3 webinar series. First webinar, we covered overall challenges in IFRS9 journey. Today, we are going to deep dive into IFRS9 modeling challenges, which is very important part of IFRS9 journey. This webinar is led by Ashley Cherian. Ashley is practice lead for IFRS9 and credit risk management at Aptivaa. He's working with Aptivaa for more than a decade. For IFRS9, he has overseen more than 25 assignments for IFRS9. And today he will take this opportunity to share some of his experiences and best practices for risk modeling. As a part of this session, there would be Q&A session open. But we will take this Q&A session towards the end in last 10 minutes. You can please feel free to put your questions, share your questions across. It would be taken towards the end. So over to you, Ashley. You can start the webinar. Still muted. You're still muted.
Yes. So I'll jump right in to the okay. So here's what we'll be covering today as part of the second in the series of webinars that we've hosted. The last one was about 3 weeks back, and as Kedar was alluding to, that was one slightly more qualitative in nature, just to give an idea of the types of implementation challenges and types of issues that banks need to tackle with right at the outset of their IFRS9 journeys to ensure that it meets with the requirements, both regulatory as well as internal. Today's session is a credit risk analytics take on IFRS 9. Focuses primarily on the data and quantitative modeling pieces. So I'll try my best to touch upon a few of these areas which I've listed on the slide here. We'll touch upon the overall model landscape in general, the methodology choices. IFRS 9 is a non-prescriptive guidance, so banks are free to choose methodologies that they deem fit. So the methodology choices that banks are typically presented with. And then we'll talk about the three pillars from Basel, which have been grafted into the IFRS 9 world. The PD, LGD, and the EAD modeling issues, options, methodology choices pertaining to all three of these. And then we'll, if time permits, we'll spend a little bit of time on other approaches that banks can potentially look at. So, as I was saying, about 45 minutes is what we have. The format of today's session allows for only a surface dealing of all of these issues. At the same time, the goal is not to take a very purist view of the concepts of PD, LGD, and EAD modeling. The goal is also to give you a glimpse of what a credit risk modeler's workflow looks like. What are the tools he uses, Excel, R, Python, give you a glimpse of what a few of the credit modelers here at Aptivaa have on their desktops to deal with modeling related challenges. So that's really the goal of today's exercise. Just to get the context straight, this is not a webinar for somebody who is completely unfamiliar with the broad requirements of IFRS 9. But at the same time, if a credit risk analyst or a credit risk analytical person who's looking for methodology choices and methodology options in general, he may find this of interest. It is not an accounting treatment related webinar today. We will not be getting into nitty-gritties of how ECL converts to provisions and how provisions for various asset classes are taken into account. And also, the third item here is actually a topic of webinar 3, which we will set up in the next couple of weeks, which is the technology related angle of the whole IFRS 9 piece of ECL computation. And we feel that is a separate, that deserves a separate treatment in itself. So we have a complete hour blocked out for the technology aspect of IFRS 9. All right. So impairment modeling overview. Again, very, very broadly, IFRS 9, as a quick recap, what has changed over IAS 39? We've moved away from the erstwhile standard for performing assets, watch list assets, and non-performing assets, and which were all sort of backward looking. At least they were definitely not forward looking. IFRS 9 distinctly forward looking in nature. They're looking at a stage-wise classification of assets, but that's not what makes it forward-looking. The requirement of an expected credit loss is right at the time of origination, and risk-sensitive expected credit loss. It's not a blanket 1.25% or a 2% that regulators used to prescribe as provisions for under the general provisioning regime. So that really is the requirement that makes IFRS 9 forward-looking in nature. Again, depending on the flavor of the IFRS 9 guidance itself, it could be a 12-month expected credit loss or the lifetime expected credit loss. But if you were to ask me, the distinction is fairly arbitrary. The CECL, for instance, looks at the entire lifetime expected credit loss. The other versions of IFRS 9, which is the one that's generally applied globally, they split the expected credit losses treatment into one for 12 months and the other for lifetime. And the reason I am told in the readings of the ITG committees, etc., is that bankers felt it was too punitive to take an expected credit losses based provisioning right at the outset, because you're sort of pricing it in your RAROC or your other pricing frameworks that you use. So that's sort of high level overview. Focus today is distinctly going to be on the impairment piece, the 12-month ECL and the lifetime ECL, and modeling data workflows, and how can you potentially go about arriving at these numbers in a regulatory compliant way, and in a way that meets with your internal requirements also. Now, when all of these requirements came up, the whole concept of an expected credit losses in itself was not a new concept. So banks have been, from the Basel era, they've been dealing with expected losses in general. Basel, of course, was what set in place the three pillars: the PD, LGD, and EAD. Interestingly, the IFRS 9 guidance itself makes no mention of probabilities of default. That's not a word that you find in the IFRS 9 guidance itself. All that IFRS 9 says is the first bullet point that we've listed down, that you evaluate a range of forward-looking macroeconomic scenarios, and that from these macroeconomic scenarios, you look at present values of cash shortfalls, and that this be an unbiased and a probability weighted estimate, probability weighted for the various scenarios that you're looking at. And banks are free to choose scenarios that they deem fit. Now, it's interesting how from this one statement, the entire industry around IFRS 9 has converged and interpreted this as guidance that looks at a combination or a function of probabilities of default, loss given default, and exposure at defaults. So the industry norm is to look at these three factors as building blocks of your IFRS 9 framework in itself. And this is what the auditors now are also comfortable with. We've known of banks that look at slightly more complex simulation-based models, which auditors generally frown upon, especially on the banking book. Broad representation of how an ECL in itself would be computed. Period on period, you would want to create a probability of default term structure, a loss given default term structure, an exposure at default term structure, and as this diagram shows, you can see survival being taken into account. So essentially for period, for period T1 and T2, it's a typo here, periods after T0, T1 and T2, you would want to look at probabilities of surviving the previous period. Please note here that T is not 1 year here. You could interpret this as 1 year, 1 month, 1 quarter, and if you want to go the whole hog, you could even assume this as 1 day. But for reasons of practicality, this the period that banks look at in general, and it varies from portfolio to portfolio and bank to bank. The best practice, so as to speak, is to at least look at 1 month periodicity. 1 quarter based periodicity is allowed, and yearly for some portfolios is also allowed. But if you were to look at yearly yearly periodicities for material portfolios, again it's kind of frowned upon by the auditors. So this is the broad setup, and as you can see very clearly here, what we need here are term structures of PD, LGD and EAD, and the next few slides will try and walk you through how we arrive at these numbers. So once this particular framework was arrived at, and this was the typical thought process. So this particular setup has been broadly alluded to by the IFRS 9 regime also, although they don't talk in PDLGD terms. This broad setup of looking at various periods, looking at discounting rates, and the discounting rate here needs to be an effective interest rate based or discounting rate that needs to be used. While this broad setup was sort of alluded to by IFRS 9, and bankers saw the guidance, and they looked at ways to go about building this infrastructure up. So components that they needed here, they saw that a lot of these components are in place via their Basel frameworks, via their credit decisioning frameworks. So the conversation then was, can we avoid rebuilding all of these models from scratch, because that doesn't make sense, right? One, there is timeline pressure in order to meet with the guidelines in general. How do we repurpose already existing models for the IFRS 9 needs? So banks that are that have not moved to advanced approaches of IFRS 9, they're likely to find that they don't have certain models in place, the PD models in place, and we'll talk about differences between through the cycle and point in time PDs in a bit. But broadly, the probabilities of default in itself, a baseline probability of default in itself, most banks have in place some models for their wholesale portfolios, for corporate and SME, because the treatment here, most banks are used to having rating models there, and for going through an approval, going through a multi-level approval process that is dependent on the rating model and the ratings being assigned. So external ratings, used to be relied upon earlier, but most banks have in place an internal rating system that relies to various degrees on the external ratings also. So, but let's broadly, assume that for wholesale book you have these models in place. On the retail side, some banks have models in place, via scorecards, application and behavioral scorecards. So there's some risk discrimination happening, risk discrimination infrastructure already in place at these banks, and the goal was to leverage that particular risk infrastructure. If that is not in place, then you would have to look at building these up from scratch. Banks that took a long view of these guidelines developed application and behavioral scorecards, and then moved to using them for IFRS 9 purposes. But those are far and few between in my experience. Most banks went with slightly more pool-based approaches for their retail portfolios. So that covers the probability of default piece, and For loss given default, what banks have in place, most banks do not have reliable, especially in this part of the world, especially in Asia in general, they do not have reliable facility risk rating models in place. The reliance is broadly on the regulatory provided LGDs, and this creates a problem because the regulatory LGDs from the Basel world are downturn LGDs. So for anybody familiar with the Basel terminology, so you've got to look at loss given defaults in a downturn period, whereas uh, IFRS 9 is not about a downturn. It's about multiple scenarios, some optimistic and some pessimistic. It's not about the downturn at all. So you've got to tweak the LGD numbers that you have for IFRS 9 purposes. EAD again, while a lot of complexity exists within EAD modeling in terms of adjusting the amortization schedule, building internal models of CCF, um, building internal models for how unutilized limits are used. So again, this presents another set of challenges because the data is so sparse, so far and few between. But then again, there's some infrastructure in place because of guidance from Basel in general, some CCO values provided by Basel, some values that are provided by regulator. So these are good starting points, but what we've seen is over the years, as banks move into year one or year two of post IFRS 9 implementation, there is a steer from the auditors and from the regulator that you compute internal estimates of exposure at default of CCFs, etc. So broadly, this is the risk infrastructure in place. Another topic of conversation within the bank used to be that it's not enough that we build IFRS 9 models. Okay, we've leveraged the Basel models as much as we can, but we also need to ensure that these are aligned to other frameworks. For banks in stress testing regimes, they need to ensure that their scenario framework, it doesn't make sense to have one set of scenario framework for your stress testing purposes, especially ones that are not prescribed by the regulator. If you're running your so-called company run stress test, then you've got to find alignment in IFRS 9 with your company run stress testing frameworks also. So these were conversation topics. Sorry, going back to stress testing, it's extremely important here. As I was saying earlier, the ECL numbers has to be probability weighted. Multiple scenarios need to be considered. So that's where the alignment needs to happen between stress testing, and for banks who move to recovery planning, there too they need to ensure alignment. Um, prepayment models again are models that mostly exist as part of your ALCO reporting in your ALM side of things, a little less so on the credit risk side of things, and it's frankly it's only an anomaly. Should ideally also be on the credit risk analytics radar, but because the primary use of prepayment rates were for liquidity planning and for interest rate risk planning in general. So it's always remained on the ALM side of things, which functionally most banks have a different ALM team. But again, from IFRS 9 perspective, if prepayment models exist within the bank, again, those need to be leveraged on as part of your IFRS 9 regime in general. But again, you know, you for people who are just getting into their IFRS 9 journeys, I'm sure it's become evidently clear that there are multiple moving parts to the IFRS 9 piece, multiple functional teams that need to be brought into the IFRS 9 program, especially in the design phase of IFRS 9. And again, even if you build these models, one time there's constant recalibration that happens, probably at a lesser frequency than the frequency with which you would generate ECLs, which typically is monthly at least. But an annual validation process has to happen on this entire IFRS 9 framework. Changes made based on the validation report limitations addressed, other mitigating steps taken. So yeah, so this is the broad conversations that banks have when they set about building up an IFRS 9 framework. So clearly, I think the consensus is that let's not build, or at least build from scratch. Let's extend existing models that are in place. Okay, let's a quick look at various methodology options that a bank typically has. And to be honest, this is not the universe of methodologies, but these are methodologies that we've seen our clients adopt as part of their IFRS 9 programs for various portfolios. So it's a very stylistic view of methodology options that are available for banks. So while we'll not be able to touch on all of these, my goal is to touch on a few of these pieces, which I will highlight in a bit. But let's look at the flow in general. Let's go top down. Actually, let's look at ECL, ECL adjusted for maturity. So essentially, the residual maturity needs to be taken into account. The ECL calculation in itself, again, as we were saying, you can go broadly two routes. You can go the individual assessment route, which is essentially going loan by loan, identifying what is the cash shortfall that IFRS 9 refers to, and under multiple scenarios, look at cash shortfalls on a cash flow projections basis, and then compute ECL. As you can imagine, this is a very onerous task for if you were to do this for the entire book. Even if you had just maybe 200 clients on your corporate book, it's an extremely onerous task. Plus, governance in itself presents a huge headache as to how these cash flows are being arrived at. But that being said, it's an excellent candidate for your stage 3 assets, which directly corresponds to the erstwhile substandard or the defaulted assets. So there again, you continue to do an account by account treatment, especially on the corporate book. And here is where the individual cash flow based assessment can be useful. For all other framework, it is a flavor of PD, LGD, and EAD. There are other combinatorial methods, slightly more simplistic methods like loss rate based methods, which have not included as part of the IFRS 9 option. Those were earlier methods that continue to be used for immaterial portfolios. Broadly, we'll touch on this three-pronged these three pillars that drives bulk of the ECL computation. So PD term structure matrix. So PD term structure, because you need probabilities of default at various points in time, and these probabilities of default through the life of the loan. So you need to have a probability of default for period 2 that is adjusted for surviving period 1. So that's where the term structure comes into picture. It's also called a PD term structure matrix because you need a probability of default at least at a rating grade level. So the matrix here really refers to the rows and columnar arrangement that would happen if you were to set this up at a rating grade level. And the typical practice, especially on the corporate book, is to look at this at a rating grade level. On the retail side, the matrix is superfluous here. Unless you have other risk discriminating segments built into the model. But typical practice is to look at probabilities of default at a segment level if you're not using application of behavioral scorecards. But if you're using application of behavioral scorecards, again, there would be some risk scores, there'd be some risk stratification, and you would get a matrix, typically with fewer rows than the corporate. Corporate, typically you have them mapped, the master rating scale is mapped to the external rating scale. So it's typically a 10 to a 21 point scale, depending on how granular the scale is. So we've got to arrive at the PD term structure matrix. How do we arrive at this? Couple of ways of going about doing this. One is the binomial method, which is slightly simplistic way of going about doing this, and we'll talk about a few of these methods here. The credit deterioration based method, which essentially takes into account not just the probability of surviving the earlier period, but also takes into account probability of transitioning to other rating grades. It could be upward or it could be downward. So how do you take into account the credit deterioration in general? And also there's a maturity adjustment that typically happens. So you've got to adjust the model for maturity in general. So this is the maturity. This is the PD term structure matrix. The macroeconomic LGD, again, you've got to adjust the instrument level LGDs for macroeconomic variables, and you have a range of methodologies here. You can use haircut based methodologies, regression based methodologies, or decision tree based methodologies. You could also use you can use beta regression to compute your LGD values. Other forms for the EAD side, you've got prepayment loans, you've got the CCF loans, CCF estimation for your instrument level EADs. So this is the broad structure of options that you have as part of ECL modeling in general. I have a few slides that talk about how what are the various options that typically get used for the corporate and retail piece. In corporate, as I was mentioning, the typical approach is to look at the rating model as a starting point. There are observed default rates for the corporate portfolio that computed, and the goal here is to derive the PIT-PDs. The PIT-PDs need to be derived from the through the cycle PDs. Your rating models typically are through the cycle models. You've got to be able to use the TTC PDs and come up with an overlay or a methodology to convert those TTC PDs into PIT PDs. So we'll do a quick walkthrough of these methodologies in general also. I have a few working templates that I hope to cover in today's exercise. And on the LGD side, there is workout LGD, that is the preferred approach, and to look at macroeconomic LGD adjustment as an overlay. On EAD, you look at adjusting amortization schedules for prepayment rates, and you would look at CCFs for revolving facilities and for non-fund based facilities. And the expectation is that these all be internally generated. I'll just highlight the differences in retail. In retail, what is happening is if the banks have application scorecards and behavioral scorecards, then a very similar process from earlier. If those models do not exist, then you would go build ways of segmenting portfolios. You'd use a cart or a chain to look at homogeneous pools. Once these pools are identified, again, pool level macroeconomic models get built for your PIT models. And again, PIT term structure, you could use the binomial approach. Typically in retail, the binomial approach is what is used. On corporate, you look at credit migration matrices, and you adjust the PDs for migration rates also. But again, no harm in bringing up in bringing in the migration matrix into the probability of default term structure in general. In the investment portfolio, because you typically do not have sufficient data to build your own models. Number of ways of doing this. Again, nowhere are we suggesting that this is the only way of going about doing this. There are banks that look at CDS pricing, CDS spreads to come up with PIT PDs. There are banks that subscribe to Bloomberg provided PDs and use those as PIT PDs. But those, the problem with those is, especially for illiquid instruments, the volatility can be hard to manage. What other banks do is to look at transition matrices that S&P now provides for specifically for the FI's portfolio. Those because those are long-term transition rates, those are TTC PDs, and then the idea is to convert those using a Wasicek formula. Formula is what the Wasicek formula is adapted from the Basel guidelines itself, and this is essentially used to convert a TTC into a PIT PD and vice versa. So the formula is available in the Basel work, in the Basel accord itself, and there's multiple papers that talk about the Wasicek formula. And this is the typical methodology that banks use when it comes to low default portfolios, when there are no default points that they can use to model the portfolio. LGD here, there is some leeway that typically gets provided by the auditors also. They also understand there isn't sufficient default data to go with. Regulatory LGDs are used, and by regulatory LGDs, it could be the Basel provided ones or your regulator provided ones. So, and most times these are unsecured deals. So you'd go with the high regulatory LGDs associated with the unsecured loans. So, next few slides, what we'll do is touch upon a few of these items. We'll start from left to right. We'll try and cover probabilities of default. How do you arrive at, what is the typical work setup when you arrive at these probabilities of default, and then we will look at issues in LGD modeling in general. Again, if time permits, we'll talk a little bit about Frey-Jacobs transformation. Again, even if you're not able to touch upon all of these today, there are a few slides that talk about these methodology frameworks, and we'll be sharing this deck with you. You can look up the paper to see what these transformations do in terms of converting, in terms of being able to come up with conditional loss given default in general. And then finally, we'll touch upon EAD. I suspect we wouldn't have time to talk in detail about EAD. So yeah, the ones highlighted in red are the focus areas for the next, I'd say, 15 minutes. Again, TTC versus PIT, concepts that have pre-existed the IFRS 9 guidance. The TTC, the Basel Accord distinctly requires that we look at through the cycle probabilities of default. Through the cycle probabilities of default are the parallel rating bands that you see here. They are, because they are long-term in nature, we're looking at average values here, whereas the PIT PDs, are allowed to move for macroeconomic conditions. Another multiple ways of looking at this, another way of defining this is a rating system that looks at both idiosyncratic and macroeconomic factors. The macroeconomic factors is key here, is said to follow a PIT rating philosophy in general. Again, there are several questions as to whether the existing rating models that you use, they are TTC or PIT. And there are several tests and there are several ways you can go about ascertaining the levels of TTC or the levels of PIT. There are no models that are 100% TTC or 100% PIT. But for sake of today's exercise, because the other one is a whole conversation in itself as to how you go about determining TTC versus PIT, we will assume that TTC ratings are available. They are available for your Basel purposes and for other reporting requirements that you've used. On the retail side, where in fact, because it's adopted as a framework, on the retail side, the norm now is to actually, even if you didn't have TTC models, the norm now is to build TTC models and then do a conversion to PIT. Although nothing's stopping the banks from creating a direct PIT model in general. So we'll talk a little bit about how this conversion happens to point in time probabilities of default, because IFRS 9 distinctly requires that a PIT PD be used, because that's what would account for movements in probabilities of default at various economic various points in the economic cycle. So what is the objective here? Objective here is we have multiple scenarios. How do we arrive at probabilities of default? We have probabilities of default, which are TTC-PDs at a rating grade level, and those are typically for 12 months duration. How do we extend that and make them into the term structure matrix that I was referring to? So step one is we've got to establish clearly relationship between the portfolio and the macroeconomic conditions. And when I say portfolio, a good proxy is to look at the default rates in itself, because that will form the link between macroeconomic conditions and the TTC probabilities of default that you have. What we also need is projections of macroeconomic variables. We will not go into modeling methodologies for macroeconomic variables here. The industry practice also is to rely on external forecasts or to take a more judgmental view of how macroeconomic variables will evolve, based on certain based on certain projections of the general economy in itself. So let's say you are provided with projections of macroeconomic variables in itself. So sources that we use as credit risk practitioners, we look at third-party sources that actually provide these forecasts for a price. They have a bunch of economists at their end who take a view on each economy, etc. But that option also is not something that most banks follow. Most banks, what they follow is look at publicly available third-party sources of information. Look at sources like the IMF, the World Bank, the bank's central bank provided forecasts, and some of these jurisdictions have their own stress testing regime. So sometimes forecasts are provided as part of the stress testing regime, and while it's not correct to be using the same set of forecasts. Sorry, I'm just going to let this pass. All right. The forecasts. So the forecasts that are provided as part of stress testing, they're actually for different purposes that regulators use to assess systemic risk in general. So while it cannot be used as is, it definitely can form a good starting point, and it will also solve you a lot of issues in terms of alignment between stress testing and IFRS 9. So yeah, so these are once you arrive at the scenario framework, say let's say you assign probabilities also, and again the typical way of going about doing this is, depending on the view of the economy, you go with a certain you assign probabilities either using a committee based approach, or you decide in a prefixed manner that the baseline scenario would obtain so and so rates. Typical way of doing this for baseline, what we've seen is baseline takes on anything between a 50 to 60% weightage, and the remaining are split between the upturn and the downturn. What we have here is a slightly different representation. So this is the broad framework in itself. And if you look here, the default rates are the starting point. So the default rates itself, how do we go about setting up the default rates? So the default rates, unlike the erstwhile NPL regime, it's definitely not EAD based. It is count of customers that have defaulted. And because the model has to be forward looking, what you typically do is at each observation point, you set up a horizon, the performance window of maybe 12 months. And the goal is to look at accounts over the next 12 months period. It's not what is the account status at the end of 10 months, but what is the account status of each account of that particular cohort at each point in the 12-month or the horizon that you have set. And if it goes into default at at any of these points, then you would consider these as default. Now it actually throws up a few issues when it comes to accounts that go into default at what we call the problem of multiple defaults in general. So essentially, especially, I just want to show you what we have in form of what we've done at our end is create a tool, and this is something that we're seeing a lot of banks do at this point, to create a tool that can automate this entire process of default rate computation. So the default data is essentially input into the tool. You have the option of computing the default rate at a facility ID level or a customer ID level. At a facility ID or an account ID is not the preferred approach, but sometimes because of limitations available in the data, you go with the facility ID, facility based default rate computation. But the ideal way to do this is, if any facility or any account of a particular customer goes into default, then the entire customer has to be tagged as default. So ideal way of computing this is to do this at a customer ID level. You identify, essentially here I'm identifying what are the DPD fields. I'm just letting the system know what are the what are the what are the various fields within the system, the date format. So if you look at the couple of things here, the performance window and the curing window. The performance window and the curing window, we've set this up at quarterly frequency. So a performance window of 4 is essentially referring to a 12-month period in time. So that's the horizon over which we will check whether the whether the account has ever gone into default or not, in which case it gets tagged as a default. The curing window is important here to deal with cases that go into default, uh, cure, and then go into default again. So the question then arises, are these two independent default events, or is it one continuing default event that started right at the beginning? So you've got to let the system know whether you want a curing window set up. Then again, this is not the only way of doing this. You can have a system where you take a blanket assumption that only the first default would be considered. But typical industry practice and a slightly better way of doing this is to look at the curing window period, and to make sure the curing window period is aligned with your staging rules, because the staging also has a certain amount of cooling off period before you can move them back between stage 1 and stage 2. So uh, right at the time of default rate computation, you would want to ensure that all of these alignments happen. So once you input this particular data, and this is a very simplistic, if you look here, just about 20 records that I'm showing here, but typically we are dealing with millions of records across multiple portfolios that we deal with as part of this exercise. And then eventually what you are able to arrive at is the observed default rate at a facility level as well as at a customer level, because we've entered both facility ID and customer ID here. You have the option of working with either the customer level facility the ODR, or the facility level ODR. The blue line here is the customer level one. So and this is the data that had actually gone in, and what we have here is one in a tabular form as to what are the ODR rates being shown. So once you have this particular exercise done, and this is crucial that you get this right, because if you get the observed default rate computation itself wrong, then your entire IFRS 9 computation or the models that you build go for a toss. So extremely important that you get sign off from business users for this observed default rate computation. So once you have this in place, couple of things that you potentially end up doing. Let's say these are the ODRs that you have with you. So the ODR observed default rates, again, a very simplistic assumption being taken here. You have in place the master rating scale, which is through the cycle in nature. Sometimes the through the cycle PDs also need to be adjusted before you go ahead and use them in your PIT computation. So you've got to be able to do a calibration exercise that looks at the observed default rates. Sometimes, so in this case, we've gotten a clean curve, but sometimes this is not monotonic in nature. You may find that the probability of default of AA is more than the probability of default of a triple B in your default rate computations. Which happens because of smaller sample sizes, etc. So you've got to adjust for that, but also you've got to adjust for the long run default rate, which in this case is the average of all of these values. You've got to ensure that in your portfolio the probabilities are derived in such a way that the overall calibrated PD matches the long run PD as much as possible. So again, this is not the only way of doing this. Essentially here we are just running a goal seek. There are multiple ways of checking for what we are essentially doing here is a goodness of fit check. You can look at HL based statistics. You can look at link functions. Essentially, if you look at the curve here, it is a established fact that the PD curve is exponential in nature. So what you have is a period where is in the lower in the higher rating grades or the better rating grades, you have a slow increase in probabilities of default, and then it exponentially increases. So which is also why we use a log odds based transformation to do the calibration. Here also what we're doing is a parallel shift, which is not evident in this because we're looking at um, we're looking at calibrated PDs and not at log odds. But if you were to look at calibrated, if you're going to look at log odds, you'll find that it's a near parallel shift that you're seeing here. So essentially, we retain the shape of the curve. Again, this is not the only way to do this. You can change the alphas and the betas to change the shape of the curve also, but you've got to have a valid reason for doing that. But here what we've done is with a beta at 1, the slope does not change. What we change is the alpha. The intercept is what changes, and you get a parallel shift. These are on log odds. So you see the parallel shift here, convert back to exponential. This is the curve that looks like. So the calibrated PDs here are higher than the initial PD estimates. And this is something that the auditors check for, that your long run averages, if your current portfolio calibration is lesser than the long run average that you've seen, that's a cause for concern as to why you've not gone ahead and calibrated it. So this is step 1. We've gotten the adjusted through the cycle PDs. Now the goal is to establish a relationship between the through the cycle PDs and macroeconomic conditions. So macroeconomic conditions, again, you can use a range of macroeconomic variables that you can use. We don't have time to go over the various macroeconomic modeling steps, but what I want to show you is a glimpse of how what are the items that we look at as part of yeah. So essentially here, this is a typical model that, again, we've set this up in an automated manner through the tool that we use here is an RShiny based tool. It auto generates model and the various diagnostic stats. We've run a linear regression here. So essentially we're doing the check for significance. We've established relationships between observed default rates and the lag of the observed default rates. And we've done this exercise for a Middle East bank. Oil is an important factor here. We've used lagged values of oil, and we've tagged this as the champion model. Typically, we build a series of models, both champion and challenger models. It's an auto-regressive model that we built, in that the lag values form a significant driver when it comes to this model. You've got to test for assumptions of linearity. You do not want to overfit the model. You've got to set out an out-of-time validation. That is the best practice, because otherwise you're just going to get an overfitted model. P-values being checked here, directionality being checked here. This is important. You don't want a model with a very high R squared. The adjusted R squared here is also at a high near 80%. But if the directionality is converse, basically suggests if the economy is improving, the default rates also improve. Now that's not an intuitive model. What we have here is crude oil, as you can consider crude oil here as a proxy for economy, and the negative estimate here indicates that as the economy increases, crude oil prices improve, default rates are expected to improve. So directionality is okay. So we've not set this up to do a out-of-time validation, which is why you get a MAPE of NAN. But essentially, you should be doing a out-of-time validation. At least check. I know the data is few and sparse between, but even with our recommendation to banks is, even if it's as few as 8 data points that you can set aside for model validation, or for out of time validation, please do that. The framework is set, and as data points add on, you will eventually in 3 years time, 4 years time, have a slightly more robust modeling framework in place. You would want to go over all of the tests of linearity. So typical tests that are done, and again, these are not the only set of tests, but these have sort of become industry practices. You would want to test for stationarity, you would want to test for heteroscedasticity, test for autocorrelation, test that residuals are normally distributed. Um, again, we've indicated a few tests here, but these are not the only tests. You can come up with a set of tests, industry standard tests that you can use for all of this. But again, you need to make sure that you're not cherry picking tests. For instance, here we have a KPSS and an ADF test. Typically, they used to test nearly the same thing with minor nuances, but it passes in one and fails in the other, and we say that, oh, okay, let's use the one that passes. So that's not quite the way to do this. And ideally, you should be looking at a combination of KPSS and ADF. Both should be passing. So these are the tests of tests that any econometrician would make sure that these are taken into account. Forecast values, the data, and then we have a section here that says that looks at the training data being used, variable plots being used. And again, this is just to give you a glimpse of how you could potentially set up your workflow, your workbench, using tools such as R, Python, SAS for that matter. But right now, open source tools are the flavor of the season, and there's plenty of stuff that you can get done via open source tools in general. So right now, let's say we've established that this is the model that we're going to use, and let's say basis this model, we have we've obtained the estimates. We've obtained the estimates that we need. The predictions are there in terms of probabilities of default. So for the sake of simplicity, let's say these are the ODRs that we obtained from the model that we just developed, and this is just in percentage here. So earlier on, we had in our example the long run average. Let me remove this. The long run average was at a 3.16. What we have here is final ODRs. These are not yet PIT PDs, but these are macroeconomic adjusted ODRs. And what you could potentially look at is, and this is a very simplistic way of doing this. This has a lot of limitations, but this is just to give you a flavor. You could look at a scalar between the long run average default rate and the final ODR, and these scalars can be used to drive the calibration to create a PD term structure. Because the goal, as I was saying, is to be able to create a term structure like this, rating grade wise, marginal PDs. What is the PIT for year one to PIT PD for your level, or whatever is the maximum residual maturity that you have in your bank. So you may not project out for 40 years. You may use other techniques to project after a particular time period. Maybe you use a mean reversion based model, or you just use you just carry forward the last available prediction with you on a go forward basis. So all of those are also options. So how do we arrive at this? Once we have the scalars in place, here it's fairly simplistic. What we do here is the calibrated TTC PDs are available. We have the rating grades here. Then it's essentially a multiplication of the calibrated TTC PDs. And okay, I'm being prompted that we've got to wrap up in the next 5-7 minutes. So you have the we have the scalar adjusted PIT ODRs, if I may put it that way. So once you have PIT, and these are the same values being pulled here, you then compute lifetime PDs. So here we've used the binomial approach, essentially uses survival as a basis for projecting it out. What you would note here is, in this particular framework, no credit migration matrices have been considered, and that's the drawback in what I'm presenting right now. Ideally, you would want to adjust these for credit migration also. But anyway, simplistic method here, binomial method for computing the lifetime PDs. And finally, what goes into your ECL calculator, and we'll talk about the ECL calculator in the next seminar, in the next webinar, when we talk about how you can use the ECL calculator to compute, the provisions number, and there are certain issues that need to be dealt with in terms of attribution and variance analysis, etc. So that's topic for next seminar. The marginal PDs essentially are, you've got to identify what is the PD for a particular year after adjusting for the previous year. So from the lifetime PD, the difference between current period and previous period lifetime PD is what gives you the marginal PD in very simplistic terms. So this is sort of, and this is essentially the term structure that goes into your ECL calculator. Again, there might be another step that you might have to do, because you'd notice here, as I was saying earlier, these are all at 1 year frequencies. You've got to convert these into periodicities as per your ECL ECL computation framework. Maybe they need this at monthly frequencies um, or quarterly frequencies, in which case the typical practice is to use an interpolation method to come up with those intermediate PD numbers. So yeah, so we've gotten the lifetime PD structure in general. So as I was fearing, we've run out of time, but I'm hoping that I was able to give you a glimpse of what's possible within the PD world. I have a few slides that I'll be sharing with you all, so which talks to a few of these points that I had indicated. On LGD modeling also, this is the typical workflow that you want to set up. You want to set up various recovery paths, identify what is the probability of moving from one recovery path to another, and then go about building models for loss given default in general. So identify probability of accounts going into each path, identify recoveries that happen or cure that happens at the end of each path, and you can build multi-stage models here. You can build for just the eventual LGD, or you can build models that predict at the end of each path what is the loss given default. But the trick here is, now there is increasing requirement from auditors that this also be a term structure based loss given default. So typically data is very sparse to be able to generate term structures, and what's become a common practice is to look at a Frey-Jacobs overlay. Again, there's another slide that talks to Frey-Jacobs overlay, which I'll be leaving at the end of this presentation, which gives you a glimpse of how you can use that technique to come up with LGD numbers in a term structure manner that you desire for your IFRS 9 computation. So I think that sort of brings us to the end of today's presentation. I'll be leaving the slides with you. The couple of questions that have been asked, one of which one of the questions is that if we use a homogeneous pool of customers, but will we have different PDs for each customers in a pool? So again, when we say a homogeneous pool, the analogy here is to the rating model from the corporate side. So the probability of default that gets associated with each rating grade is the same for all of the customers, because that's the way the model is typically set up for, and this is from reasons of practicality, right? Otherwise, even if you were building logistic regression models and you did have detailed scores, for practicality reasons, you would apply a single probability of default to the entire pool. So which is why on the retail side, you would want to build you'd want to build as much risk stratification as in general as possible. But the risk stratification, once you've stratified that, the homogeneous pool, you would want to go with the same PD for all customers in that particular pool. That's the whole idea behind setting up these pools. So yeah, you do lose a little bit of granularity. And then there's another question from Manu, who says there's an increasing tendency for a loan to default in the initial years, and then the probability reverses. How do you capture this? Yeah, so correct. So what actually happens, which is why the marginal PDs are important, right? I mean, what we are looking at is, when you create a term structure, we are not interested in we're not interested in cumulative PDs at any points in time. Over the life of the loan. What we are interested in is the marginal probability of default in general. So the aspect that is being referred to here is already being captured when you look at marginal PDs as a difference between probabilities of default of the lifetime PDs of the current period and the previous period. So that to some extent captures the probability of default in general. But I think the question here is that how do we capture memory here? How do we capture, given a residual maturity, given the customer has gone through significant vintage, what is the way of capturing this? So frankly, we've not seen these type of models being built, but this kind of a framework would be possible where you to build hazard rate models, where you to build, say, a Cox hazard rate model, where the survival rates are captured and adjusted for the history that's already passed. So in that kind of a survival rate modeling, you'd be able to capture this memory of the past state in itself. But in the current framework, it's not all bad, because what we are saying essentially is, irrespective of what the customer did in the past, the current rating grade is a reflection of the risk of default that the client carries, right? Or the bank carries vis-a-vis the client. So that to some extent captures the nuance that Anup has pointed out. But I see Anup's point. The past states are not being captured in the current framework. For that you would have to use a completely different hazard rate model. The problem with hazard rate models, and we've built hazard rate models for certain clients, over time they become extremely difficult to manage. And also what also happens is it becomes extremely difficult to explain to senior management what's happening. How do we explain the volatility that seemingly emerges from these hazard rate models? So that's been our experience. Again, as I was saying, multiple ways of skinning the cat, not the end all in terms of methodologies. I think that is it. We've overshot this meeting by 5 minutes. I apologize for that. Closing remarks. We're going to follow this up with the next webinar, which would look at how the the outputs of steps that we discussed in this webinar, how they are carried forward into the ECL calculator, and how they are used for provisions computation. But that will take on a distinctly technology flavor, and it's a plug from our side because we have a software solution that does this for you. So we'll also do a small walkthrough of the various analysis that can happen as part of the ECL computation. Over to you, Kedar.
Yes, certainly. We will do that very soon, and we will once again publish with the invite. For today's topic, I think it was a very vast topic, and it was very difficult to fit into 1 hour webinar. And thank you, Ashley, for this tremendous effort to fit into it. And if there are any more questions, certainly we can take it offline. Needless to say that our services are available to you for your disposal for all of these areas of IFRS 9. Addition to this, if you want to refer the distinct knowledge about this, we have published a number of webinars on IFRS 9, especially into risk modeling, which are available on our website, www.aptivaa.com. Please visit the section in thought leadership. You will find this blogs or white papers, and which are free to download. And any other information required, please feel free to connect to me. With this, let me thank you all the participants and the panelists and conclude this webinar. See you in the third webinar in this series, which we will going to publish very soon. Thank you so much.